What if the person you ignored held the key to your survival? A billionaire CEO lies dying in a luxury resort, and the only person who can save him is the one he just told to stay in her lane. But here's the twist: she's going to save his life anyway, even though he'll never see it coming. Evergreen Mountain Resort. $800 a night buys you marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of silence that money demands. Here, staff are invisible, guests are gods, and everyone knows their place in the hierarchy. Sophie Miller, 27, moves through these halls like a shadow with a cleaning cart. She's the shy girl everyone overlooks, the one who cleans the rooms of people who make more in an hour than she makes in a year. Her uniform bears a small, faded pin, "Student Nurse, Dropped Out." It's a badge of failure she can't quite bring herself to remove. Room 1247 houses Nathan Brooks, the tech mogul whose medical software empire revolutionized hospitals worldwide. He's here hiding from lawsuits, from public scrutiny, from a world that suddenly questions his judgment. To him, Sophie is furniture, useful, silent, forgettable. The power dynamic is crystal clear. He commands, she obeys. He speaks, she listens. He matters, she doesn't. But Sophie carries something Nathan doesn't know about: a heartwarming yet tragic connection to medicine that runs deeper than his software algorithms. Every morning, she touches the textbook in her cart and remembers her mother's inspirational words: "You don't need a white coat to save a life, sweetheart. You just need eyes that see and a heart that cares." Her mother was a nurse who died from a misdiagnosed illness, spotted too late by doctors who thought they knew better than the people who loved her most. Sophie left nursing school the day after the funeral, convinced she'd never be smart enough, credentialed enough, important enough to matter in a world of medical degrees and white coats. Now she cleans the rooms of people who barely acknowledge her existence, carrying medical knowledge she'll never use, and motivational lessons from a mother who believed in her when no one else would. Can a cleaning lady's unnoticed wisdom outshine a doctor's arrogance? Stay with Storyloom to find out how one quiet voice changes everything. This morning, something different happens in room 1247. As Sophie quietly gathers towels around Nathan's sleeping form, she notices something on his exposed calf that makes her blood run cold: a red mark with a distinctive clear center that looks exactly like the medical textbook photos her mother once showed her. It's a bullseye rash, the calling card of Lyme disease. And judging by its appearance, Nathan Brooks has maybe weeks before the infection reaches his heart and brain. Sophie's hands tremble as she sets down her cleaning supplies. She knows what she's looking at. She knows what it means. And she knows that in this world of credentials and hierarchies, no one will listen to a cleaning lady's medical opinion. But her mother's voice whispers in her memory: "Sometimes, sweetheart, being right matters more than being heard." What happens when the person everyone ignores holds the key to saving a life? And time is running out. 3 days passed in a rhythm of polite invisibility. Sophie cleaned Nathan's suite each morning, watching helplessly as subtle changes began to transform the man she had tried to warn. The confident stride became a careful walk. The sharp focus in his eyes grew cloudy with fatigue. The hands that had once commanded boardrooms now trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. But it was more than just the physical changes that caught Sophie's trained eye. Nathan's morning routine, once precise as clockwork, had become erratic. He'd sit at his laptop for hours without typing, staring at the screen with a confusion that seemed to surprise him. She'd find his coffee cups scattered around the suite, half empty and forgotten, as if he'd lost track of where he'd set them down. The shy girl, who had learned to be invisible, found herself memorizing details that might matter later. The way he rubbed his temples during phone calls. How he'd pause mid-sentence, searching for words that used to come effortlessly. The inspirational business magazines stacked unread on his nightstand while he dozed fitfully during daylight hours. Dr. Charles Grady arrived on Thursday, his black Mercedes cutting through the mountain mist like expensive authority. He was Nathan's longtime personal physician and old family friend, someone who had been making house calls to the Brooks family for over a decade. Tall, silver-haired, carrying the kind of presence that made lesser mortals step aside. He swept into the resort with the confidence of a man whose opinion had never been questioned by anyone who mattered. Sophie was in the hallway, polishing brass fixtures, when she first saw him stride past, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble with the rhythm of absolute certainty. She recognized the type immediately, the kind of doctor who treated symptoms on paper rather than people in person, who trusted tests more than intuition. The resort manager, Mr. Harrison, personally escorted Dr. Grady to Nathan's suite, his demeanor shifting from professional courtesy to obvious deference. Sophie had worked at Evergreen long enough to recognize the subtle signs of hierarchy reshuffling. When someone arrived who commanded more respect than the guests themselves, everyone's behavior changed. Sophie was quietly organizing cleaning supplies in the suite's walk-in closet when she overheard their consultation from the adjacent sitting room. The doors had been left partially open, and Dr. Grady's authoritative voice carried clearly through the space. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something about Dr. Grady's dismissive tone made her pause, her heart beginning to race with a familiar anxiety. "Just stress, Nathan." Dr. Grady's voice carried that particular brand of certainty that wealthy men used to dismiss inconvenient truths. 12 months of litigation would exhaust anyone. The mountain air, the humidity, your body is simply adjusting. A few good nights' sleep, perhaps some light exercise. But the joint pain, Charles, and I keep losing my train of thought mid-conversation. Psychosomatic. The mind is a powerful thing. Your body is manifesting the stress of your legal troubles. I've seen it countless times in executives under pressure. Nothing a week of proper rest won't cure. Sophie froze among the hanging clothes, her hands clenched so tightly around the cleaning supplies that her knuckles went white. She had heard these exact words before, 5 years ago, when her mother's colleagues had dismissed her mother's concerns as nurse anxiety and occupational hypochondria. "What about blood work?" Nathan asked, and Sophie found herself holding her breath. "Unnecessary. I can diagnose stress without subjecting you to a battery of expensive tests. Trust me, Nathan. I've been practicing medicine longer than that cleaning girl has been alive." The casual cruelty of that statement hit Sophie like a physical blow. Dr. Grady didn't even know she existed, yet somehow, he had made her irrelevant to a conversation about symptoms she had identified days ago. That evening, as she finished her rounds, Sophie found Nathan in the resort's library, slumped in a leather chair with a book unopened in his lap. The confident CEO had been replaced by someone fragile, someone fighting a battle he couldn't name, against an enemy he couldn't see. The library had become her refuge during difficult shifts, a quiet space where guests rarely ventured after dinner. She hadn't expected to find Nathan there, looking so utterly defeated that her nurturing instincts overrode her survival instincts for the first time since their awkward encounter. He looked up when she entered the room, not through her, not past her, but at her. Really at her. The change was so startling that she nearly dropped her cleaning supplies. "You're Sophie, right?" His voice was hoarser, in a way that sleep couldn't cure. "Sophie Miller." She nodded, surprised he knew her name, surprised he was using it. In her 3 years at Evergreen, guests had called her Miss, "You there?" or simply gestured in her direction when they needed something. "I keep thinking about what you said, about the tick." He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at the movement that shouldn't have caused pain. "Why did you notice it?" Sophie's throat went dry. This was dangerous territory, the space between her past and her present, between who she used to be and who she had been forced to become. "My mother was a nurse," this shy girl said quietly. "She taught me to pay attention to things that didn't belong." "Was?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sophie could have deflected, changed the subject, retreated back into invisibility. Instead, something about Nathan's genuine curiosity made her answer honestly. "She died 5 years ago. Misdiagnosed pneumonia that was actually a rare autoimmune condition. By the time they figured it out, her organs were already shutting down." Sophie's voice caught slightly on the words she had never spoken aloud to a stranger. The attending physician said her symptoms were typical nursing hypochondria, that healthcare workers always think they're sicker than they are. Nathan leaned forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing something valuable in her quiet honesty. "Is that why you left nursing school?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She had grown so used to being overlooked that having someone see her, really see her, felt both terrifying and strangely motivational. "I couldn't save her," she whispered. "What was the point of trying to save anyone else?" "But you still tried to save me." Sophie met his gaze for just a moment before looking away. Some habits die hard. Nathan studied her face with an intensity that made her want to disappear back into her comfortable invisibility. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was everything I'm not, Sophie said, her voice barely audible. Confident, respected, trusted. She could walk into any room and people would listen to her. Maybe you're more like her than you think. The words hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest, not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing. The hope that maybe her voice did matter, that maybe her mother's lessons hadn't died with her. The next morning brought changes that couldn't be dismissed as stress. Nathan's left hand had developed a slight tremor that he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket. His words occasionally slurred at the edges, so subtly that anyone not paying close attention might miss it. But Sophie was always paying attention. She had learned from her mother that the devil lived in details, that life and death often hung on the things that seemed too small to matter. During her morning cleaning, she noticed new details that painted a troubling picture. Nathan's handwriting, once sharp and decisive, had become shaky and uncertain. She found pages of notes where he had started sentences and abandoned them mid-thought. His laptop showed multiple browser tabs open to medical websites, searches for joint pain, memory problems, unexplained fatigue. He was trying to diagnose himself. She realized the man who had dismissed her concerns was now desperately searching for answers that his expensive doctor refused to provide. Dr. Grady returned that afternoon, his confidence undimmed by the progression of symptoms that should have alarmed any competent physician. Sophie lingered in the hallway outside Nathan's suite, her cart positioned so she could hear their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. The tremor is stress-related, Dr. Grady pronounced with the authority of someone who had never been wrong. Perhaps a mild anxiety disorder brought on by your legal troubles. I can prescribe something for that. Charles, I feel like my brain is wrapped in cotton. Yesterday, I forgot my own phone number. This isn't stress. Nathan, you're a brilliant man, but you're not a doctor. Leave the diagnosis to those of us who actually went to medical school. These symptoms are textbook manifestations of executive burnout. The casual cruelty of that last statement made Sophie's blood run cold. She had heard variations of it her entire life, the weapon that people with credentials used against those without them. But sometimes credentials blinded you to truth, and sometimes the person with no medical training at all might be the one who saves a life. I want blood work done, Nathan said, his voice firmer than it had been in days. If it will put your mind at ease, fine, but I assure you will find nothing but elevated stress hormones and perhaps some vitamin deficiencies from your irregular eating habits. Sophie heard the dismissal in Dr. Grady's tone, the same dismissal her mother had faced when she tried to advocate for her own health. The system that was supposed to heal had instead created a hierarchy where being right mattered less than being credentialed. That night, after her shift ended, Sophie sat in her small apartment above the resort staff quarters, surrounded by her mother's medical journals. The room was sparse but clean, filled with the kind of practical furniture that came with staff housing. But the bookshelves told a different story: medical textbooks, nursing journals, volumes of clinical studies that most people would find incomprehensible. She cross-referenced symptoms, compared timelines, built a case that no one would ever let her present. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: Nathan Brooks was dying of something entirely preventable, if only someone would listen to the person who had no right to speak. Her mother's nursing bag sat on the desk, untouched for 5 years, but carefully maintained. Sophie opened it with reverent hands, finding the stethoscope and blood pressure cuff that had once seemed like magical tools in her mother's competent hands. There was a thermometer, pen light, basic supplies that represented everything Sophie had walked away from. But tonight, they represented possibility. Sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places, but what happens when pride is more powerful than proof? Join Storyloom to see how Sophie risks everything to save a life. The anonymous note appeared on Nathan's nightstand, like a whisper made tangible: please test for Lyme disease. Early signs are treatable. Stage 2 can affect your heart and nervous system. Stage 3 can be permanent. Someone who cares. Nathan read it 3 times, his hands shaking not from illness, but from something approaching fear. The handwriting was careful, feminine, the words chosen with precision that spoke of medical knowledge. Whoever had written this knew exactly what they were talking about. But Dr. Grady dismissed it with a laugh that held more contempt than humor. Anonymous medical advice, Nathan, please. Anyone can look up symptoms on the internet. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that stress produces. You're letting your imagination run wild. What if they're right? They're not. And even if there was some truth to it, Lyme disease is a rural myth, overdiagnosed by country doctors who don't know any better. The chances of you contracting it at a resort of this caliber are essentially zero. But zero wasn't zero enough for Nathan. Not anymore. The tremor in his left hand had spread to his arm. The brain fog had thickened until simple decisions felt like navigating through molasses. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a cleaning lady's quiet voice kept repeating, "It could be tick-related." Friday morning brought the crisis that changed everything. Sophie found him collapsed in his bathroom, conscious, but unable to move the left side of his face. The confident CEO, who had dismissed her concerns 3 days earlier, could barely speak, his words slurred by the partial paralysis that had crept across his features like a slow-moving storm. "Help," he whispered, the word barely recognizable. Sophie didn't hesitate. She called 911, her voice steady and clear as she provided symptoms and timeline to the dispatcher. Then she stayed with him, her small hand gripping his larger one. Her presence, the only stability in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. "It's going to be okay," she told him, though her own heart was racing. "This is treatable. We caught it in time." The paramedics arrived with efficiency born of experience. But it was the emergency room doctor who provided the confirmation that split Nathan's world into before and after. Dr. Sarah Chen, young and sharp-eyed, took one look at the bullseye rash that was now impossible to ignore and ordered immediate blood tests. "Lyme disease," she announced an hour later, her voice matter-of-fact but kind. "Stage 2, affecting your facial nerves. But you're lucky. If this had progressed to stage 3, we'd be looking at permanent neurological damage." Nathan lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling as the antibiotic drip began its work. Lucky. He was lucky because someone had been paying attention, someone whose concerns he had dismissed without a second thought. "The facial paralysis should resolve in a few weeks," Dr. Chen continued. "But I have to ask, how did you know to get tested? Most people don't recognize the early symptoms." Nathan turned his head toward the window, where evening light was painting the mountains gold. "Someone tried to tell me. Someone I didn't listen to." Dr. Grady appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. The blood tests didn't lie, and his reputation suddenly felt as fragile as Nathan's health had been just hours before. "Nathan, get out." Nathan's voice was quiet, but absolute. "Just get out." After Dr. Grady slunk away, Nathan asked the nurse to call the resort. He needed to speak to Sophie Miller. He needed to thank the woman whose voice he had been too proud to hear. But Sophie wasn't answering her phone. When the resort manager finally tracked her down, she was sitting in the staff parking lot, her resignation letter clutched in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she told her supervisor through tears that had been building for 5 years. "I tried to help someone, and when they finally realized I was right, I felt empty, like it was too little, too late." She was climbing into her old Honda when Nathan appeared beside her car, still wearing hospital scrubs and moving carefully, but under his own power. The left side of his face remained slightly slack, but his eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. "Don't go," he said simply. Sophie rolled down her window, wiping tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "You're okay. That's what matters." "No, what matters is that you saved my life, and I treated you like you were invisible." Nathan knelt beside her car, bringing himself to her eye level. "I was wrong about everything, about you, about what matters, about who deserves to be heard." For the first time since her mother's death, Sophie felt something shift inside her chest, not healing, not yet, but the possibility of healing, the hope that maybe her voice did matter, that maybe her mother's lessons hadn't died with her. "I'm not a doctor," she whispered. "No," Nathan agreed, his lopsided smile somehow more genuine than any expression she had seen from him before. "You're something better. You're someone who cares enough to see what others miss. The moment was unexpectedly heartwarming in its raw honesty. When pride nearly costs everything, can two broken people find a way to heal each other? Recovery, Nathan discovered, was not a straight line, but a winding path that required both humility and help. The antibiotics cleared the infection from his system, but the real healing happened in quieter moments, in conversations that rebuilt his understanding of what intelligence actually meant. Sophie hadn't quit. After all, she had stayed, not as his cleaning lady, but as something harder to define, a friend, perhaps, or simply someone who had earned the right to be heard. They met each evening in the resort library, where she shared her mother's medical journals, and he shared his vision for making healthcare technology more accessible to the people who needed it most. "Your mother was brilliant," Nathan said one evening, looking up from a nursing journal filled with careful annotations in the margins. "These insights about patient observation, about the importance of listening to subtle changes, this is exactly what we're missing in modern medicine." Sophie traced her finger along her mother's handwriting, remembering late nights when she had been her mother's study partner, learning to see patterns where others saw only symptoms. She always said that technology should amplify human judgment, not replace it. What if it could do both? Nathan leaned forward, the businessman in him recognizing opportunity. What if we created something that helped doctors listen better, that gave weight to observations from people like you? The idea took shape slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains. Nathan's software company had the technical expertise. Sophie had the clinical insight that came from years of watching and learning and caring. Together, they began designing something unprecedented, a diagnostic tool that democratized medical observation, that gave voice to the voiceless. But first, there were apologies to make. The confrontation with Dr. Grady happened at Nathan's lawyer's office, a sterile conference room where reputations went to die. The older doctor sat across from them, his silver hair perfectly styled, but his confidence finally cracked. "You nearly killed me," Nathan said without preamble. "Your arrogance, your refusal to consider that someone without your credentials might know something you didn't, it almost cost me my life." Dr. Grady shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Nathan, you have to understand, no, you have to understand." Nathan gestured to Sophie, who sat quietly beside him. "This woman saw what you missed. She knew what you didn't. And you dismissed her because she cleans rooms instead of examining them." The lawsuit that followed made headlines, not because of the money involved, but because of the precedent it set. For the first time in medical history, a patient had successfully sued a doctor, not for misdiagnosis, but for diagnostic arrogance, for refusing to listen to non-medical observations that proved accurate. The settlement funded something even more important than justice, it funded change. 6 months later, Nathan stood on a stage at the annual Medical Technology Conference, his face fully healed, but marked by something deeper than physical recovery. Beside him, Sophie wore a simple black dress and the kind of quiet confidence that came from being heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan began, his voice carrying to the back of the packed auditorium. "I want to tell you about the day a cleaning lady saved my life." The story unfolded like a masterclass in humility. Nathan spared no detail in describing his arrogance, his dismissal of Sophie's concerns, the near-fatal cost of his pride. The audience of doctors, nurses, and healthcare executives listened in rapt silence as he delivered this inspirational deconstruction of everything they thought they knew about expertise and authority. "We've created a medical system that values credentials over observation, degrees over intuition, titles over truth," Nathan continued. "And in doing so, we've silenced some of the most important voices in healthcare, the people who spend the most time with patients, who notice the subtle changes, who care enough to pay attention." He turned to Sophie, who stepped forward with the grace of someone who had finally found her voice. "This is Sophie Miller. She's not a doctor, but she sees what doctors miss. She's not a nurse, but she understands what nurses know. She's the person we should have been listening to all along." Sophie's speech was brief but profound, her words carrying the weight of every dismissed observation, every ignored concern, every life that might have been saved if someone had simply listened. It was inspirational in its simplicity and power. "I don't need a white coat to care about people," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I don't need a medical degree to notice when something's wrong. What I need, what we all need, is a healthcare system that recognizes wisdom wherever it comes from." The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. Can two people who found each other in the darkest moment transform an entire system? 3 years later, the Evergreen Institute for Collaborative Healthcare occupied a sprawling campus in the Connecticut mountains, not far from the resort where it all began. The building's design reflected its mission: glass walls instead of closed doors, circular seating instead of hierarchical arrangements, spaces that encouraged conversation between people who might never have spoken in traditional medical settings. Sophie walked through the halls with the measured pace of someone who had learned to trust her own authority. The white coat she wore bore no name tag, no list of degrees, just a simple pin that read Chief Observer, a title Nathan had created specifically for her role in training healthcare workers to recognize and value non-clinical observations. It had raised eyebrows in the medical community, but the measurable improvements in early diagnosis rates spoke louder than credentials. The Institute's diagnostic app, powered by Sophie's insights and Nathan's technology, had already prevented dozens of cases like Nathan's own. Cleaning staff, teachers, family members, anyone who spent significant time with another person could input observations that the system would analyze for patterns that might indicate serious illness. Medical professionals made the final diagnosis, but now they had access to information they had never considered before. Sophie, Nathan appeared at her office door, holding a familiar-looking envelope. The CDC wants to expand the Lyme surveillance program nationwide. They're using our model as the template. She looked up from her desk, where patient observation reports were scattered like pieces of a puzzle only she could solve. 8 years ago, she had left nursing school, convinced that she couldn't save anyone. Now she was saving people she would never meet, lives that hung in the balance between observation and action. My mother would be proud, Sophie said softly. She would be amazed, Nathan corrected. You've built something she couldn't have imagined. Through the window, they could see the first group of the day arriving for the Institute's community education program: retail workers, hotel staff, teachers, parents, people who had never considered themselves part of the healthcare system, but who were learning to recognize the signs that doctors might miss. Nathan joined Sophie at the window, watching as a young woman demonstrated how to identify tick-borne illness symptoms to a group of summer camp counselors. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day? Sophie considered the question, remembering the terrified, shy girl who had trembled while trying to warn a man who wouldn't listen. I think about all the times I didn't speak up, she said finally. All the observations I kept to myself because I thought they didn't matter. And now I know that every voice matters, every observation, every person who cares enough to pay attention. She turned from the window to face him. And Nathan saw in her eyes the woman who had emerged from the shadow of tragedy. We're not just changing how medicine works, Nathan. We're changing who gets to practice it. The afternoon brought their weekly case review, where medical professionals and community observers worked together to analyze diagnostic challenges. Sophie watched as an emergency room nurse deferred to a janitor's observations about patient behavior patterns, as a renowned cardiologist asked a patient's daughter about subtle changes she had noticed at home. The transformation was motivational to witness. This was the revolution they had started, not dramatic or loud, but deep and lasting. A healthcare system that listened as carefully as it looked, that valued caring as much as knowing, that understood that sometimes the person with no medical training at all might be the one who saves a life. As the sun set over the mountains, Sophie and Nathan walked the same forest paths where ticks had once threatened, and observation had triumphed. Nathan's health had returned completely, but the man who emerged from that crisis bore little resemblance to the arrogant CEO who had once dismissed a cleaning lady's concerns. Their friendship had become something heartwarming and enduring. "Thank you," he said quietly, words that had become a ritual between them. "For what?" Sophie asked, though she knew the answer. "For seeing me when I couldn't see you. For saving my life when I wouldn't save my pride. For showing me that the most important thing about intelligence isn't what you know. It's caring enough to notice what you don't." They paused at a clearing where the Institute was building its next expansion, a training center for healthcare workers who wanted to learn the art of listening to voices they had never heard before. The foundation was already laid, but the real structure would be built from changed minds and open hearts. Sophie smiled, feeling her mother's presence in the evening breeze. Some lessons are worth learning the hard way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales on Storyloom. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep watching Storyloom.